Hello and welcome to my Econ 12 report on global inequality and why and how it should be reduced. We'll start with some history and definitions, go on to the problems with inequality, and detail several approaches to reduce it. Inequality is the distribution of wealth in a society. It is often measured by the Gini coefficient, a number between 0 and 1, where 0 is completely equal society, and 1 means all the wealth in the society is controlled by one person. Alright, on to the history. So we're mainly looking at the 20th century and developed nations, and this century started with very high levels of inequality. It took the combined effects of 2 world wars and the Great Depression to lower it. However, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it began to rise again and hasn't stopped since, charting essentially a big U-curve through the century. But it doesn't just rise and change for no reason. Inequality isn't a natural phenomenon. It can be changed by tax systems. Look at these graphs. It's been trending upwards, and there's obviously been a change in our tax system that has augmented this process. So again, we can see that the top 0.1% and 1% have captured a huge amount of wealth compared to the rest of society, partially because of the changes to our tax system. In fact, The Guardian reports that of all the new wealth created in 2017, 82% went to the top 1% of earners. And understandably, the increasing income share of the top 1% makes some people very angry. Occupy Wall Street, or the Occupy movement, was founded in 2011 to protest economic inequalities, their slogan being, "We are the 99%, a commentary on the high incomes of the 1%. And this movement was partly a response to the failure of the global financial system in 2008. It was leaderless and quickly became a global protest against the decline in true democracy around the world and the control of government by the economic elite. This movement, while not changing the fundamental structure of society, arguably had an important influence on the landscape of the political debate. It brought economic inequality and the general feeling that governments weren't serving the interests of their people to the forefront of the public consciousness." So that's some history. Now let's address why inequality matters. Why are we talking about this, and why should we seek to reduce it? Well, first point, in developing nations, high inequality leads to social unrest, as those in desperate poverty seek to change the system that enriches only a few. This unrest and instability is bad for growth. If a country becomes embroiled in a civil war, people aren't really working, so output is reduced. And furthermore, revolutions or the violent repressions of revolutionaries creates an unsafe investment climate. People won't invest in war torn nations, right? It's too risky. And this paucity of investment further slows growth. Also in developed nations, even in developed nations, right? Public resentment of the elite can fuel populist movements and economic policies that don't actually make sense, like growth-reducing protectionism. So that brings us to another aspect of inequality, that it sucks. I mean, it's closely linked with poverty, which has many detrimental effects, not least that it sucks to be poor. Poor people can't afford to send their kids to college, the population is less educated than it could be. Therefore, inequality leads to a decline in human capital, meaning less growth as less production per person. Plus, once people fall beneath a certain income threshold, as they do in a highly unequal society, they essentially become a burden on society. They fall ill more easily because of stress and poor diet, so that's a cost in healthcare, drug addiction, homelessness, crime, they hurt everyone as well. So inequality matters for the simple reason that it causes suffering, and that suffering affects all of society. A couple years ago, and here's our final point, the IMF found that high inequality is negatively correlated with growth. So part of this is related to the previous factors, human capital, stability. The poor are much likely to be sicker and less educated, meaning they can't produce as much wealth. And there's also the final reason that inequality lowers aggregate demand, because in general, rich people spend less of their income. Meaning if we take income from the higher classes and redistribute it to the lower and middle classes, those people have more of a need for that money and they'll spend more of it in the economy. So the total demand for goods and services increases, and that leads to growth. And now let's look at another reason why we should have completely equal society. It's the idea of utility maximization in relation to the marginal utility of wealth. So we start with the basic idea that society should try to maximize the utility. The greatest happiness of the greatest number is our prime goal. We know that money has decreasing marginal utility. So total utility is increased if wealth is distributed equally, because rich people can't get as much pleasure from their money as poor people can. The maximum pleasure is found when everyone has the same amount of money. So in the absence of any other considerations, like the cost of imposing complete equality or its effect on innovation and growth, we should have complete equality. That's the status quo, and any departure from that needs to be justified. Let's take a brief segue into the issue of Canadian inequality. So my main source for this was a report by the Canadian Society of Chartered Accountants. The main thing that we're looking at is that it's not so bad in our country, but the main thing about it is that it's heavily centered in urban areas. So the large cities are where we find most of the inequality in Canada, but the municipal governments of those cities don't have the taxation tools or policy tools to tackle inequality. The conclusion then is that provinces should delegate more of their powers to towns and cities so that they can have a localized approach to inequality. Another thing important in Canada, of course, is tax policy. Higher tax rates on corporations and the rich would reduce inequality and so would greater benefits for the poor. In the election, the Liberals won, so there won't be a dramatic increase of progressivity, but there won't be any big cuts to the top rates. So that's good. Things haven't changed much, and it'll probably trend upwards a little bit, but it's not a huge issue in Canada. And overall, it's just important to bear in mind that as the incomes of the top 1% increase, they increase at the expense of the middle class. It's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from the pockets of the middle class. Okay, so that's a lot. We've gone over some of the reasons why inequality is undesirable. How are we proposing to reduce it? None of these approaches that I'll suggest are mutually exclusive. Each country will need to do different things suited to their own economy and political climate. Some solutions, though, like the wealth tax or ending tax havens, require international cooperation. So, first, the global wealth tax. And this one is, in my opinion, one of the most promising methods for reducing global inequality. A wealth tax to be raised, perhaps at 1 or 2% on millionaires, up to 10% on the richest billionaires. That means we take 1 or 2% of their total wealth as determined by government accountants every single year. And this has the immediate effect of reducing the wealth of the wealthy and increasing government revenue, which can be used to fund social programs such as education or poverty benefits. Furthermore, it's easier to effectively tax wealth than income. That's one argument for this system, because income can often be disguised or diverted through complex networks of foundations and shells and corporations. But taxing wealth is very direct. It's, okay, you have this much wealth, we're going to take this much of it. It also effectively reduces the rate of return on investment. If you make 5% return on $500 million of assets, but the government takes 2% of your assets every year, you are essentially making a 3% return. And this is important for two reasons. First, as Thomas Piketty, the main proponent of this wealth tax, argues, inequality is inevitable when the rate of return R is greater than the growth rate G. That's because the income of the rich increases at the rate of return on investments, since most of the money is in investments, but the general wages of the population increase only at the same rate, roughly, as the economy. So unless some form of wealth tax, which reduces the rate of return on investment, is imposed, those who have money will naturally get more, irrespective of their contributions to society. Natural productivity. Second, this wealth tax acts as a tax on unproductive capital. This is a little interesting feature about it. Not maybe the main argument, but interesting. Safe investments, like just sitting on a pile of money or buying government bonds, tend to generate low returns. But if we reduce the return further by imposing a wealth tax, safe investments often end up actually losing money or not gaining any money at all. So this forces wealth to risk money in high return investments. This moves wealth from safe investments to high return investments that are more societally useful but more risky to the rich, leading to a more dynamic economy. Final thing about the wealth tax, though, is that to be effective, it must be internationally applied. If only one country imposes the tax, the rich just move their assets to a more friendly tax regime. That's why a lot of local wealth taxes have failed historically. So there should be a global or at least semi-global wealth tax, and in addition, automatic sharing of financial information between countries so that the wealth tax can effectively work and the wealthy can't hide their money. There is one flaw, though, that I should mention, which is that it can be hard to accurately evaluate wealth when it's the form of cars, houses, art, and things like this. But it's not really an argument against the whole idea. It's just a minor hitch that we need to find accounting methods and proper reporting of financial information to deal with. Okay, second idea to reduce inequality is just to raise income taxes, right? If the rich have very high incomes, if the poor need more money, why don't we just tax the wealthy at high rates and increase social spending? Historically, this has been a very effective method during the 1950s, a time of relative prosperity and equality in the US. The top tax rate was as much as 92%. It fell a little bit in the 60s and 70s, but in 1982, Reagan dropped it to 50%, and now it's a little less than 40%. In Canada, the top tax rate varies between provinces, but it's around 50%. But historically, we know that it can be much higher without having huge distorting effects on the economy. There's definitely room to raise the top income rates, and that's definitely been something that's making its way onto the political agenda with the Democratic presidential nominations. Okay, next one, education. This one is based on the idea that inequality is largely related to low wages, but wages are determined by market forces. If you educate someone, they're going to be more competitive in the job market, and they will have a higher income, reducing inequality because people will have higher incomes in the lower and middle classes. This is also important because one reason for the rise in inequality as of late has been technological change, which essentially creates a skill premium that leaves behind the poor and the children of the poor whose education isn't as available or as high quality. So making education available to all people and increasing its quality can help ensure that no one is left behind in an era of technological change. I like this solution because it changes things structurally and lets the market reach a more equal place instead of enforcing inequality through heavy-handed measures like taxes. Now let's go into some very old ideas about how to increase the power of the lower classes and reduce inequality, and that is increase the bargaining power of workers, make unions easier to form, raise the minimum wage. This helps correct the gap between productivity growth and average wage that we've seen in the last little while. And then here's the one I'm most passionate about, which is reducing capital flight from developed nations. And this is, I think, the most important thing we can do to reduce inequality globally. Capital flight is when investors or capital owners move their funds from one country to another. And in many cases, this is done to maximize returns on portfolios, right? If a country is undergoing political turmoil or the currency is being devalued, it makes sense to move your money. But a lot of capital flight can also be motivated by a desire to avoid taxation or to avoid the legal authorities because the money that you're getting out of the country was made illegally and you fear prosecution, i.e. it's like proceeds from smuggling, embezzlement, and so on. The capital flight of this nature is endemic in African nations and is not tied to business cycles or investor confidence. It's happening all the time. And essentially it's because African nations have weak tax schemes and lack the clout or expertise to negotiate bilateral treaties with tax havens or financial institutions. So smugglers, despots, and corporations can make money in Africa, often by wantonly harvesting natural resources, and that money isn't reinvested in African growth. That's part of the reason the continent is so poor. The money isn't even taxed. So even though the amount of economic activity in African nations increases, much of the wealth goes straight to the elite instead of to the poor or to government programs. Africa as a whole, the scientific literature is clear here, could pay off many of its debts and reduce dependence on foreign aid if it could develop a more effective tax system and reduce capital flight. How does this relate to inequality? Well, reducing extreme poverty in Africa would reduce global inequality, which is actually largely because of differences in the wealth of nations, not because of fluctuations in the distribution of wealth within nations. So developed nations should do more to help African nations and other poor nations around the world crack down on capital flight and other illicit flows of wealth, bringing more accountability to the global financial system, and, in the words of former German President Horst Kohler, letting tax havens wither away would be a good first step. Perhaps rich nations should focus development aid on creating effective tax collection systems in developing nations so the wealth created there stays there instead of escaping to Credit Suisse or the Cayman Islands. Actually, on that note, eliminating tax havens would do a lot to reduce inequality within developed nations as well, because it becomes easier to assess and fairly tax the fortunes of wealthy individuals or corporations, which often hide them in offshore accounts. And this goes in line with Thomas Piketty's ideas, as I mentioned in the Global Wealth Tax, about automatic bank info sharing and financial transparency. Making everyone able to see wealth makes it easier to have that wealth shared evenly. So conclusion. The approaches detailed here differ widely, but there's a common thread. Inequality needs to be taken seriously and the world needs to cooperate to reduce it. It may take, as the Occupy movement believes, a radical restructuring of our entire economy and our mode of being. Whatever it takes. I want to end with a quote from the IMF. They say, average wages have risen at a slower pace than productivity growth amidst large economic rents. For example, high profitability and large increases in executive compensation accruing to the top end of the income distribution, unquote. That's the core of why inequality is such an important topic today. Growth of the economy should benefit all people fairly and equally, but it doesn't. It benefits the rich. We need to find ways to change that without damaging prosperity. Thank you.